paper titled Representing Translation as Conforming to Ubuntu, a neo-utilitarian approach to select of, neo-utilitarian approach of select Urdu short fiction. I'm sorry, I missed the spelling there. It's off, right? It's not two, right? That's the title of the paper. Now, Urdu literature in translation is one of the least sought after works in English. One of the objectives of this lecture is to introduce Urdu literature translation in English as an index of literary works that has the scope for literary interpretation and research. Like Urdu literature has not been sought after very much. Ubuntu, which is of a, you could consider that as a transnational philosophy from a third world country like Africa, which is very close to being non-existent. In a way, you could say that, Africa is nowhere in the vicinity when we talk about, especially research frameworks, right? As much as we, I could say that, we are in the next step, right? At least a little forward. Yet another objective of this lecture is to consider Ubuntu, your 2000-year-old African philosophy, as a theoretical framework. The third objective of this lecture is to consequentially elaborate the neo-utilitarian aspect of reading Urdu literature. The outcomes, scholars and the audience who are listening to me, you will be able to infer the multicultural bearings of a text that is being introduced to you through this lecture. Scholars will also be able to use Ubuntu as a research framework. Now, the short fiction that I have selected for this lecture are part of an anthology which is selected and translated by Muhammad Umar Memon. You could find him in the picture to the right, to the top of me, titled The Greatest Urdu Stories Ever Told, which was published in the year 2017. You would even find, references from, esteemed writers like Salman Rushdie about this particular work. That is with regards to the issue of Urdu literature not being spoken of as an canonical work, right? We do not hear much about Urdu literature, and that is one of the reasons I was attracted towards Urdu literature when I have first heard that I'm going to talk in a translation e-conference, right? So Muhammad Umar Memon is an emeritus professor of Urdu literature and Islamic studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a critic, short story writer, translator, and editor. This work, called The Greatest Urdu Stories Ever Told, contains 25 short fictional works. It's an anthology of short fiction, 25 short fiction. And to scholars who are interested, even though the number is less, there is a mix of women writers in the list who have not been heard of much. So there is a double jeopardy here, right? Even Urdu literature, we could say that in the in the forefront of literature and research framework, we do not hear much about the productivity of Urdu literature. But then even in that, there's a double jeopardy where women writers are less heard of, right? Even in canonical literature, women writers are less scared of, which is not the same as much as we see today. Times are changing, thanks to technology itself, and thanks to so many other factors which contribute to literary productivity on the whole. Ismat Chugdai, Jamila Hashmi, Karatulain Haider, Khalida Asgar, Altaf Fatima, Zakia Masadi are among the list of writers whose work has been translated. And those are the women writers' names you would see in this anthology itself. Now, These are the selected works I have read out of the 25 works which I deemed interesting and relevant to whatever I'm going to try and present in front of you in terms of trying to represent Ubuntu with a neo-utilitarian approach. Ali Imam Naqvi, who wrote The Vultures of the Parsi Cemetery, he was born in Mumbai and resides at Mumbai. He works for the Iran Council. Then Intizar Hussain, who's also, who wrote this work called The Back Room. He was born in Uttar Pradesh and later migrated to Pakistan in 1947. And 1947, know why it is, right? The partition, right? And he migrated there. His novel Bati, right? Bati, and I'm sure that is the right spelling because it is the local language. It's the Urdu language. If I'm wrong, somebody could correct me. Bati, right? Was nominated for Man Booker Prize in the year 2013. And then you have none other than Ismat Chugtai. She's counted among the earliest and foremost women Urdu writers. Her published works include several collections of short stories, 3 novellas, and 2 novels. And then you have Muhammad Salim ur Rahman, the story called Voices. He was born in India. He is considered as an eminent Urdu poet and a critic. He started his literary career with an Urdu translation of Homer's Odyssey. Then you have Munshi Premchand. The title, he wrote the short fiction titled The Shroud. He is one of the earliest writers of Urdu fiction. He has authored more than a dozen novels, over 200 short stories, several essays, and translations of foreign literary works. Then you have Monto. He is one of the most popular names in Urdu literature. He was born in Lahore. He is considered to be, considered to be contributing the largest number of and consistently high and equally qualitative, also equally controversial creative work to the partition corpus, right? So whenever you hear the term partition, maybe you would remember, and then you get the names springing out of your mind, and one of the names would be Monto, right? So yes, okay. Now moving on, let us look at the context for the whole lecture and the presentation. I have 3 contexts for you, as much as is evident from the title itself. And the context is Ubuntu, neo-utilitarian, and the Dastan tradition, right? So we will look at the first context, Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu is the common name given to 2000-year-old philosophy, African philosophy, which I did mention as a passing comment in the beginning. It translates into I do not exist if you do not exist. Now, Ubuntu is an African word. To be very specific, it is from the Zulu language, right? At least there are Zulus, Kafirs, and Maasais, which is one of the tribal races we know, we commonly ubiquitously know from Africa. And it is Ubuntu is a part of the Zulu system, the Zulu language system. Now, this Ubuntu does not belong only to the Zulu tribe, right? Now, this idea, this philosophy has migrated kind of all over of Africa, and then they themselves, each place in Africa has its own term for Ubuntu. But then the common philosophy is Ubuntu. Uh, so the phrase should be strictly connotated in a philosophical sense, thus advocating the idea of coexistence. So whenever I say Ubuntu, think about coexistence, or even try to remember the word humanity, right? Now, it might sound irrelevant, irrelevant in the terms of looking at a research framework, but then you should know that there have been many research works which have been presented worldwide in the last 30 to 40 years, considering Ubuntu as a socially relevant topic, right? So if it could be socially relevant, it could be relevant to literature as well. That is my take on Ubuntu. Now look at this quote. Please allow me to read. Over 2000 years ago, black people of Africa developed a collective meaning to life to describe the kind of relationship an individual person is expected to have with their family, community, society, environment, and their spiritual world. Now, don't you think, even if it is, societally relevant, socially relevant, don't you think, we are all working towards, literature is working towards intersubjectivity, right? And when you're working intersubjectively, I think this would bring us back into context, and also put ourselves, or try to suspend ourselves into a research framework, and that is the idea of bringing in Ubuntu, right? Now, moving on, then we will look at, you know Dastan, right? In the tradition of Dastan. The base for Urdu literature actually springs from the Dastan tradition, right? Dastan, right? Dastan tradition. Dastan tradition is an oral tradition originating from Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, from Central Asia, right? Dastan is a noun, right? Dastan is a noun, and it is used for a single person, and sometimes it could also be considered as a historical figure, right? Now we have this. If you have to ask about a local, equivalent, right? The Vigadagavi, right? Or Tenali Raman, right? Tenali Raman is not just Tenali Raman, right? The character Tenali Raman, right? He is a kind of a historical figure now, right? So you have the Vigadagavis, right? People who are witty as well as humorous, right? It's not just Tenali Raman. There is a whole tradition, right? We call them the Vidushagans, right? The Vidushagas, right? The Vidushagas follow that tradition, right? And then we associate Tenali Raman with the tradition of Vidushaga. So this Vidushaga is not a name, which is in reference to a single person, right? In the same manner, Dastan is not, maybe, in the past it could have referred to a single person, but then today it does not mean so, right? So the Dastan is a patriarch who takes care of the tribe, right? He aims at educating his community, and also seen as a teaching tool. What manner? In manners of telling stories about his own tribe, right? So stories, out of all, there should be many teachers amongst you, right? And then future teachers also, right? What do you think is the best method to be learner centric than storytelling, right? And you should be good with storytelling to make the story better. So Dastan is one who follows that oral tradition, by which he conveys stories, right? So storytelling becomes an art, right? The nodal point of the Dastan and the Ubuntu converge at this juncture of intersubjectivity, right? So on one side you have Ubuntu, which focuses on humanity, trying to be intersubjective, right? And the other side you have the Dastan, who is also doing the same thing one way or the other, right? Except we are not trying to be very specific, but then that is exactly the point. The Dastan, the oral tradition, is also trying to do the same thing, right? Okay, right. Okay, now we will look at a neo-utilitarian, right? Neo-utilitarianism. Now, neo-utilitarianism, if at all you look at it from an ideational factors standpoint, they can be examined at all. If at all it has to be examined, it could be rendered in strictly instrumental terms, right? Instrumental terms, useful or not to self-regarding individuals, right? So look at the words being used: instrumental, right? Terms useful, right? Self-regarding individuals, right? So one way or the other, we know the meaning of utility, right? And then utilitarian, neo-utilitarian, right? There is a new way of looking at how utilitarian, how an object or a literary artifact, we are going to consider the works we are dealing with as a literary artifact, how we can look at it as an utility, right? Now, I have to give you a statutory warning when I say utility. That is why I, specifically, and then, deliberately, and then very much consciously used the phrase neo-utilitarian rather than just calling it utilitarian, right? So do not take it for granted and then think that that the literary artifact is being called as a utility doesn't mean doesn't mean you could use it as a throwaway object, right? You use it, you throw it away. No, right? So neo-utilitarian, right? Now, please allow me to read. You have a quote in front of you, right? Utilitarianism is an effort to provide an answer to the practical question: what ought a person to do? The answer is that a person ought to act so as to maximize happiness or pleasure and to minimize unhappiness or pain. So utilitarianism from an ethical standpoint, right? Or even let me go a step and then say that utilitarianism is an normative ethical theory, right? That's how we get utilitarianism. It's not the same way we literature people approach it. Social or economic researchers, they deal it in a different manner. So it could be looked at in that manner. So as it is evident from the quote, the utility of an object is decided by its ability to maximize one's happiness. Now it is imminent that human being is always at the receiving end, right? He's always at the receiving end, right? And that is why I did kind of give you a statutory warning. I said maybe we shouldn't fall for it and then say that how is it this is useful to me, this is not useful to me, right? It is imminent to think that only the human beings at the end of he's at the receiving end, right? Yet the imposition of Ubuntu makes available to us a preconception that humanity is the beneficiary in this equation, right? So at least for this lecture, we will consider human beings to be the beneficiaries, right? Let us not stumble ourselves into asking the question, how can a literary artifact only be used as an utility, or how can we to use a heavily loaded term like commodification. We are not trying to commodify literary artifact here. Rather, we are trying to look at it from an ethical perspective, as it is quoted in front of you, saying, how a person's happiness could be maximized, right? And to maximize that, we are going to try and turn our concerns towards Ubuntu, right? By reading through the text that have been quoted to you before, right? Yes. Moving on. Right. Now let us look at some textual illustrations. Enough of looking at what Ubuntu means, what neo-utilitarian, and trying to put ourselves into a context so that we orient ourselves towards understanding the text selected for this lecture. Right. So textual illustration. Right. So this is the roadmap. Right. How am I going to interpret using Ubuntu, using neo-utilitarian principles? Right? And the Dastan tradition. How am I going to interpret the 6 or 7 texts I have readied for this lecture? I'm going to look at the descent of privilege through black humor, right? So I'm going to use black humor as a tool, like we could also use Ubuntu as a tool, utilitarianism as a tool. Next, I'm going to throw some critical insight into partition through Ubuntu, and then I'm also going to have an eco-critical perspective towards these texts that I have selected. Right. Okay. The first text, the shroud. Right. Now, Munshi Premchand's The Shroud, in a subtle manner, portrays a carefree existence because of the general condition of those toiling away day and night. So it does talk about the marginalized people, people who are not managers, right? People who are daily wage laborers, right? The statements, right? Look at the statements, look at the quote, right? Please allow me to read the first 2 quotes. While the 2 men were perhaps waiting for her to kick the bucket, right? Kick the bucket. Hope you understand, right? Her to kick the bucket so that they could finally get some peaceful sleep. Okay. Look at the second quote. I have never seen her face without her veil on. If she sees me in her senseless state, she wouldn't be able to thrash freely out of modesty. Now you could see traces of black humor in both these quotes, but then what gets us to focus is the third quotation, which is a separate paragraph. Please allow me to read that also. Now, people tend to be tight-fisted. They say, don't spend too much on weddings. Don't spend too much on funerals. Just ask them. So, what are you going to do with what all you have been squeezing out of the poor? Squeezing never stops. Frugality kicks in only when it comes to spending, right? In just 4 or 5 sentences, Munshi Premchand shows the disparity between the so-called managers of resources and the laborers and the daily laborers, right? The statements are made by people who had the privilege, right? You could interpret and then think that it is made not from privileged person, but then in the receiving end is the privileged people, and there are also people who take advantage of the dismal circumstances of the peasantry, right? So how do they take advantage of the circumstances of the people who are daily laborers? The advice is always only for others, right? So you could see there is a Jishu and Madhu in this short story called The Shroud, where uh, Jishu is the father, Madhu is the son, and Madhu's wife is ailing, right? She is pregnant. She's, sadly, she's about to die. You could see that, you could see the phrase, kick the bucket in the first quotation that is given to you here, quoted in front of you. And, they go around asking for, money, and then they have no others to turn other than the managers, their own managers, right? Landlords, right? So they go to the landlords, and how is that, this is an aside comment they are giving, the third paragraph, right? So when they ask for money, they are tight twisted, right? They give you all sorts of advices. What's the advices they give? Don't spend too much on weddings, don't spend too much on funerals, right? But then look at the comment, look at the sarcastic comment, frugality kicks in only when it comes to spending, right? The landlord, right? It's a criticism. The landlord, according to Jishu and Madhu, they want to earn all the money, but then for that, there is no frugality, right? They never say, stop, right? You have given me more than what is necessary. But then when it comes to spending, they show their frugality, right? Now, the editor and translator of his works, right? These works, Muhammad Umar Memon, right, is considered to be of, he considered these to be of phenomenal output. Munshi Premchand's The Shroud is a phenomenal output. And he also states, you could see the last quotation there. It is by Muhammad Umar Memon himself. He quotes Munshi Premchand's passionate belief in the transformative agency of literature in ridding society of its myriad social and religious ills, right? Now, you do know that Munshi Premchand has been writing for a very long time. He has written collections of works, and then most of his works can be categorized under one particular umbrella called being a progressive writer, right? Now, progressive writer might have its bearings in a different manner today, but then these were people who were Marxists, right? They were going for working for the marginalized people. So that is where it comes from. And then he was not a flimsy kind of a guy. Munshi Premchand, you could see, you could go for yourself, read Munshi Premchand's The Shroud, and then you could understand how he has internalized this issue, right? So this is an indicator. The whole story is an indicator of a change of spending culture, but a sarcastic tone, like I told you, is taken up to show the culture of the ruling class in a neo-utilitarian manner, right? Next, let us move on to the next text that has been selected, Toba Texin, right, by Sadat Hassan Manto, right? Now, the idea of Ubuntu is supported by, critically looking at an existing conflict. That is what is happening thing in Toba Texing, right? I'm very sure Toba Texing is very popular. It is a prescribed piece in many of the colleges all over India and elsewhere also, right? Toba Texing is very famous, right? Like I told you, Manto is an inevitable person who cannot be disregarded when you talk about Urdu literature, right? So in the context of partition, like I did tell you, right, he talks a lot about partition, right? You can only think about Manto, Kushwant Singh, and others when you talk about partition. And Kushwant Singh again has extensively wrote on partition as well. Here you could see here Manto expresses as a narrator that he does not showcase himself as the narrator, but then there is a persona, right? And the persona comments, please allow me to read. A few years after partition, the thought occurred to the governments of Pakistan and Hindustan that, as with ordinary prisoners, an exchange of lunatics was in order. Muslim madmen in Indian asylums should be sent over to Pakistan, and the Hindu and Sikh lunatics languishing in Pakistani madhouses should be handed over to Hindustan, right? Of course, he's being sarcastic again, right? He is not finding fault with any particular group of people, right? He, very directly, right? Very consciously and directly, he says that both sides are at fault, right? And all of those who are at fault are madmen, right? Who has to be sent to asylum. That's not the idea. The story does not talk about, it is literal, right? It is about a madman called Toba Texin, right? He's not actually called Toba Texin, but then as soon as he dies, his name gets changed into Toba Texin, right? So you could look at partition, you could throw your critical insight into partition and look at how things are. Look at that how Manto is giving us a social commentary in a very subtle manner, in a very obvious manner, right? Like I told you, he is not supporting either side. He knows, and then he gives his own social comment that both sides are at fault, right? Moving on, the next work we'll be doing is we'll be looking at is the vultures of Parsi cemetery, right? Which is written by Ali Imam Naqvi, right? We have three concerns here, right? And then I'm going to let you know one by one. The story gives an eco-critical perspective. That's what I did tell you in the beginning. It gives you an eco-critical perspective. The phenomenon of stealing, or you could call it taking from nature, too much from nature, right? Also that, we should have that also. Too much from nature has resulted in an erasure of certain cores of nature, certain artifacts of nature, certain crudely, objects of nature. This in return, hinders or directly hinders with the funeral custom of the Parsis. The Parsis who also hail from Central Asia and now very much a part of India's history, follows a unique funeral tradition. Some of you might have heard about it. The Zoroastrians, people who follow Zoroastrianism for centuries together have been fixated on not polluting nature while disposing of their dead, right? So the funeral ritual, the unique funeral ritual is called the sky burial, and it is performed by leaving the corpse out in the open for vultures. Crows also eat them, vultures eat them, and other bodies to consume, right? It's a kind of offering, right? That we all of us, one way or the other, have our funeral rites in this manner. Take for Hindus, for example, right? Once the soul leaves, it's a belief among Hindus that the body is only a tool, right? And when the soul departs, the soul has seven births, right? And then the soul will take up some other shape, right? And it's kind of the same issue we are looking at here, the sky burial, except the belief of the soul departing and then going on to some other object, some other body, right? Some other place it could reside in, right? The body, right? The body, it cannot be left just like that. So what do? They offer it to the vultures, right? Now why vultures? The other birds, there are other scavenging birds, but then why particularly vultures? Simple, right? The vultures which live, you should know there is a place called Tower of Silence in Hyderabad and also Mumbai, right? They have closed it by now because this is kind of becoming too hard on the vultures. I'll tell you a little later why. That's the eco-critical perspective we are also looking at. The burial ground is called the Tower of Silence. Very aptly named. Tower of Silence. It is more or less like an amphitheater where the bodies are brought out and then left just like that. And vultures from the vicinity, they fly, come, they dig into the corpse, they finish eating. That's it, right? There are other birds which come also, especially crows, right? But then why vultures? Imagine 20 to 30 crows trying to devour a corpse, right? It would take 2 to 3 days. And imagine the management, the waste management, the leftovers, the bones, right, and stuff like that. But then a vulture could digest it, right? We do know that, right? All of us watch our share of Discovery and Animal Planet. We know how vultures are kind of in a way the king of the jungles, right? They are the ones also the scavengers of the jungle. They go on the both sides, right? King of the jungle and scavenger of the jungle, right? So we have this concern where like the Parsis, the Parsis look at it in a very specific manner, unlike what we do now, right? What we look at. The Parsis were concerned that if the vultures go into extinct, because they did, around 2004, 2005, there was an issue, especially in Mumbai, right? What happened? The vultures will not be caged, they fly free. And then they were trained, right? Trained in the sense they know to come back, right? They know when to come back. Maybe you might ask this question, what's the logic? If 2 or 3 days, if nobody dies, what would the vulture do? Of course, they have a board. What they will do is that they slaughter a goat, they feed it to the vultures so that they return every other day or every day, right? So that they are nicely fed. But then around 2004, 2005, there was a problem, right? The problem was this: the cows, the goats, cattle altogether, which are seen in the vicinity in Maharashtra, in and around Mumbai, they were fed with certain kind of fodder, right? And the fodder had a certain kind of a digestive drug, right? And it was totally they didn't mean to do it, but then it so happened, nobody knew. Only late after, people found out that that was the problem, right? So these vultures which ate these cows and goats, dead goats and cows which ate that particular kind of fodder, or got that particular kind of medication, they started dying, right? And then within 1 or 2 years, 90% of the vulture population of Mumbai fell. And look at what, right? The Parsis, they were not able to bury their dead, right? So they saw this as an issue. They tried to conserve vulture. They really tried to do that. Between 2004 to 2014, they tried to conserve this vulture. And after 2014, they understood that it is a lost cause. Now, recently, I hear that they have started cremating their dead people. That's what it is, right? So I think that is a perspective, right? So look at the fact here, look at the perspective here, and look at the eco-critical perspective here. Humans, human beings, are in straight conflict with nature, and in turn, what does it do to us, right? It affects us even culturally, right? Immediately, it affects us culturally, right? Maybe vulture goes extinct, the cycle, the food cycle, the food web, right, would be tormented, would be disturbed. Maybe you might think that if not for this cultural problem, it might come back to us 50 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. But then look at that, it is like immediate disposition, right? Immediately, a cultural group called the Parsis, they saw that immediate effect, right? Now, Ali Imam Naqvi in the story, The Vultures of Parsi Cemetery, has written the story somewhere between the years 2007 and 2014. The same time, I'm mentioning about the vultures going extinct, right? Now, Naqvi was a resident of Mumbai and died in 2014. So the years overlap with the vanishing of vultures in Mumbai, right? So the Parsis in Mumbai then met with the dire situation, like I told you, when the corpses of the dead people in their community were not consumed by vultures simply because of the reason that they vanished after consuming dead cattle that were administered with certain drugs. It is a proven fact, right? It is a proven fact. The dilemma of the situation could be understood as it is a unique practice which the Parsis have. They have followed it for centuries and centuries together, right? You cannot suddenly stop it. You cannot think about suddenly stopping it, right? So their custom has to continue. Sadly, their custom does not continue, right? As of this year, the last 4 or 5 years, I hear the Tower of Silence have been closed down. I think, I recently saw a newspaper that, Hyderabad is trying to revive this Tower of Silence, right? That is the name of their burial ground, right? So surprisingly, Ali Imam Naqvi, in his short story, uses this phenomenon of vultures vanishing to give the story an exorbitant twist, right? The vultures in the story vanish because there is a riot between the Hindus and the Muslims, right? Let us look at that quote a little later. I'll also show it to you, right? But then, like I told you, it is in the same time where Ali Imam Naqvi was, making an observation on this Parsi funeral tradition, and it was the same time he was trying to write a story on partition, and then he used both of these things together, right? Now in the story you don't have the vultures vanishing because they are dead. They vanish sadly because riots because of the partition is happening between the Hindus and the Muslims. So you have these funeral workers who are casually talking, and they are taking away three corpses one after the other, right? They take three corpses one after the other and then leave it in the amphitheater, the Tower of Silence, and then they come back when there is a fourth corpse. When they come back, they're surprised, after 2 hours, because there is not one vulture in that place. Then they call the board directors, right? And then they throw an investigation, and then they later find out that the vulture does not go extinct or die. Nothing happens. They are not, caught. They are not shot. But then, they find their food somewhere else. And where is that somewhere else? Is that by a river where Hindus and Muslims fight with each other, right? So look at how Ali Imam Naqvi uses an ecocritical standpoint and then uses it to depict something like this to us, right? Okay, so moving on, let us look at the next example, right? Of fifths and rubs, right, by Ismat Chugtai, right? Now, it crudely depicts the effect of class divide in access to healthcare, right? If at all, I will show you the quotation a little later. I have it with me. Right. So the novel is about Rati Bai, right? A sanitation worker. But then we also should notice this issue. This Rati Bai, she is not a permanent worker in this hospital. She is only somebody who was, temporarily used for her services as a sanitation worker. There is a full detailed thing about it in the story. Maybe you get time and then you could go read it. We will get to the point, right? The get to the point what we are trying to talk about here. Now, Rati Bai, working as a sanitation worker, involves herself in a dangerous practice, right? The dangerous practice is to abort children, right? There are young women who come to uh, their health center, and Ratibai, who's not a nurse, not even a nurse, right? She's not a doctor, she's not even a nurse, she's only a sanitary worker who helps, I would say, right? Within quotation, helps young women to abort their children. Now we go into the details now, right? Now, why should a woman abort her kid, right? Because of poverty, right? Because of the reason that it's an unwanted birth, right? Because they were not using contraceptive pills, and then they do not have money to get contraceptive pills, right? So on and so forth. So why do they come here? They cannot afford to abort the kid in a hospital which charges money to them, right? So they come here, and it is less of charge, but then it's highly dangerous, right? Now, if at all you look at the title, you would understand one thing. The title is Of Fists and Rubs, right? Now, if you read the story, you would come across the situation where fists mean it's a method of aborting a kid, right? And rubs is the second method of aborting a kid, right? Each one is dangerous than the other, right? And the first one is kind of okay, right? But then it is equally dangerous. The second one is much more dangerous, and then you could even use the word disgusting, right? Maybe, let me tell you, because it is crudely depicted by Ismet Chugdai. Why does she do that? She wants to, not censor it. She wants to not disgust you, because there is a blog on the internet which says when they hear the story actually in Urdu, one of the listeners, they puked hearing the actual language. I read it in English, but then is somebody who hear the recording in Urdu, they puked, hearing the way it has been described, right? So what is the description, right? The description is this: rubs is nothing but the young woman will be made to lay flat on a bed, right? And the sanitary worker Ratibai will hold a rope which is hanging from the ceiling. She will stand on top of the baby bump, and then she will try to squeeze out the baby, right? Now, even to read it, it gets into your mind, right? How could this be possible, right? What are you talking here? Let me get to that. That's the concern we are going to look at, right? So that is the first method. And the second method, like I told you, it is much more yeah, equally dangerous, much more dangerous, right? How does it happen? The second method, the fists, right? So so for many people, Rati Bai does not seem to feel bad about it, right? But then she says, I'm a sinner, right? She has in a bragging manner, she says that I have many I have did many abortions for young women, right? And this is the first process, the rubs, right? That the way of rubbing Ratibai's feet around the baby bump and then trying to get the baby out, right? In a forceful manner, is the rubs method. What is the fists method? Like I told you, it is much more dangerous, right? The sanitary worker, Rati Bai, does not follow any kind of hygiene. And what she does? She just like that thumbs her fist into the mother's uterus and then literally pulls out the baby, right? Now, this is the way Ismat Chugdai does not turn away from the social evil. This is a social evil, right? Social evil just is I would say, is an euphemistic term. It only expresses it in a light manner, right? It's just an euphemistic word, but then you could try and call it in some other terms, right? Ismat Chugdai does not turn away from expressing this concern to people that many women, poor women in India do not have access to proper health care, right? They do not have proper access to healthcare, right? And then this is not just the issue of poor young women or poor women having not having access to healthcare, right? It is much more than that. It is also about the class divide, right? The class divide. Why? Maybe do you think Ismat Chugdai would represent a woman hailing from some other socio-economic class to be coming to Ratibai to this health center and then performing an abortion on herself? No, I don't think so, right? So somehow it is interconnected, right? We talk about access to healthcare, but then it obviously somehow one way or the other happens because of class divide, right? Now, if you try to connect all these stories one way or the other, they try to hit at the point, trying to say there is a socio-economic issue involved, right? Now, the translations of these texts is the critical standpoint that converge together and conform to the idea of Ubuntu. Now, it is quite obvious that the text themselves acts as Dustin, right? You do see it, right? Dustin. For example, there are two other stories which I did not, show the quotations to you: the voices and the back room, right? Now, these two short stories, they themselves act as Dustin, right? There is a storyteller inside the story who is talking about, or conveying or a memory transfer, right? So the Dastan tradition is actually that, right? If you look at it deeply as a researcher, as a research scholar, what is the tradition of Dastan? The Dastan is a memory transfer, right? He's transferring the scientific knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the societal knowledge, the communal knowledge, also the linguistic knowledge of one generation to another generation, right? It does happen so much in our own lives also, right? For example, right, it's so common for in a village where a small kid runs, falls, trips over. If he bruises his knee, right, if you find bruises all over his knee, the first reaction from a grandmommy, right, a mother will learn from the grandmother, but then the grandmother will immediately react, right? She could see that the kid is bleeding. She would immediately react, trying to get some tea powder or coffee powder, and then apply it to the wound, the bruises, so that the blood clots, right? Now, how did this grandmother know that the tea powder and the coffee powder are anti coagulants, right? They don't allow the blood to run, right? They coagulate them, right? They make them clot. They make the blood to clot, right? Now, who transferred this knowledge, right? Somehow the grandmother learned it from her mother, from their mother, right? Now the Dastan tradition is that, right? So the Dastan tradition, which is crippled by the language, right? Why is it crippled by the language? The Dastan tradition is typically from Central Asia, and the Dastan is practiced through the language of Urdu, right? So it is only roughly spoken by around 7 crore people all over the world. But the act of translation, right, makes the story to reach 20% of the world's population, right? Effectively centered on utilizing the maximum capacity of the text, right? So how do I say 20%, right? It is being translated into English. We know our demography. We know that 20% of the world population could read English, right? So, David Crystal, the famous, language expert, he says that, also a critic, right? He famously says that at least by 2015, 2016, the native speakers of English have been outnumbered by the, second language, speakers of English language by a ratio of 3:1, right? So if it is one native speaker, there are three English language speakers in the second, as a second language, right? So that is the kind of a thing. So by this translation, by this act of translation, only the utility that made by only 7%, 7 crore people, right? Not 7%, 7 crore people who learn to convey or transfer the knowledge to only 7 crore people all over the world. Now, through this act of translation, 20% of the world population is able to access, right? However, the texts that have been carefully selected exhibit a neo-utilitarian purpose, not as an object, like I told you in the beginning, which is waiting to be utilized, but it serves as a bridge between two worlds, right? So you might remember, I told you, I gave you a statutory warning that you should not consider this to be an object, right? It's an artifact. It is okay to use the word utilitarian, right? So it acts, the act of translation acts as a bridge between two worlds, one which could have possibly sunk along with the decline of the language. Instead, it has been revived, right? So there are many languages in the world which are seeing its demise, right? Including languages, right? There are many languages, especially in the Pacific region, right? There are at least 1,000 languages. A survey says that, which is only spoken by only 1% in the world, right? So there are patches of islands in the Pacific region, and there are people in this island, and then they have no outer world contact. When this happens, the language dies off when the last person on the island dies away, right? That is an issue, right? Okay, moving on. In all the textual illustrations that have been presented, may it be the socio economic condition of the marginalized in Ismat Chughta's short fiction of Fists and Rubs, or the expression of eco-criticism in Ali Imam Naqvi's short fiction, or the political turmoil expressed in Manto's short fiction, or the gloomy scenario that projects out of Munshi Premchand's short fiction, goes against the idea of Ubuntu, right? That's the fair point of this whole lecture. It goes against the idea of Ubuntu. So we ourselves are asking 2 to 3 basic questions. Where is the humanity here? How many dustans do we need to make societal values less vulnerable, or are we asking the wrong questions as to being devastatingly anthropocentric by disregarding nature and environment? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir, for your delightful presentation. You have clearly explained Ubuntu, the 2000-year-old research framework of the Africans in present writers as well as Urdu writers, and the tradition of Dastan, the connection with family, society, spiritual issues, and utilitarian problems of our contemporary life. With the session coming to an end, I would like to ask the participants if they would like to give their observations, reviews, or pose any questions to the resource person. You can do so now. Please pose your questions if you have any. All the participants have given a positive feedback, sir. They have really enjoyed your sagacious, informative, and insightful session. Very well then, I would like to thank Dr. Kannan Prasad for being with us today and sharing his insights on Ubuntu as a research framework. And we have also learned translation and where it stands with society, family, and a lot of issues related to our world. So I really thank Sir for presenting his wonderful lecture and his beautiful PowerPoint slides.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. We hope that you will continue to work with us and support us for the future.
Definitely, ma'am. Definitely. It's a pleasure. It's an honor and pleasure to work with you all. It's an opportunity to me as well, right? To showcase my talents also. Thank you very much, Dr. Fatima. Thank you very much, Dr. Rajanta and Nirmal sir also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We are indeed delighted to be with you as you with us. Dear participants, we come to the end of today's session. Please join tomorrow's session at 9:30 a.m. with the same link for Zoom. Using the same Zoom link, please join the meeting tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. We have yet more three other speakers who will indeed make the program more exciting. Thank you for being with us today. Have a wonderful evening.